Yes, perfect.
Thanks.
Okay, now, I like to think about my presentations as performance art, in a way that I always go out of a presentation with more knowledge than I walked into the presentation with. It's something magical that happens when you're together with an audience. Somehow you think differently and new stuff comes out. And this is very different. I'm a bioengineer by education. So for years I've been looking for ways to kind of marry IT and biotechnology together. And I keep finding new ways. And you'll see what I mean in a moment. So I'm Kristof Van Tomme. I'm the founder of Pronovix. Developer experience is hard work. And I think, well, I hope that by now everybody knows that API documentation is about developer experience, right? It's about creating an experience for developers so that they can quickly onboard and get started and not get stuck in places, you know, getting access keys and whatever. And but it's really a lot of work, because when we just started working on developer portals with our company, when we specialized, we started doing research. And these are just 9 of the different types of documentation that we found that a dev portal needs to have. And that's just a lot. And especially if you have like hundreds of APIs, it just gets too much. So we've been seen several customers starting with just API products and have only a few APIs, and then bumping into this like, oh crap, how do we do this now for all these APIs? So now I'll try to answer, to some extent, this question. I'll talk about these 2 fields, these 2 main problems that I see when you start scaling API documentation and developer portals and your API program in general. The big one is findability and discoverability. They're actually 2 problems, but I'll treat them as one because they're somewhat related. And then the other one is difficulty for finding funding. It's a really interesting question. I'll come to it in a moment. So first, findability and discoverability. What often happens is that large enterprise, they've had SOA, they've got lots and lots of services, and they're like, okay, we're going to turn this all into APIs and just dump this thing into the dev portal, especially internally. And you have this wild growth. Lots and lots of APIs with obscure names, some called __, capital A, and then the name, so that they would be the first in the list because it's not searchable, and stuff like that. And you immediately see that with all this documentation that's required, that's a serious problem. It gets worse because most organizations, they've gotten rid of most of their technical writers. Most of the companies we talk with don't have technical writers. And or if they have a technical writer, it'll be someone who's doing editorial reviews on documentation that's being generated by other people. And those other people are both business and technical people, because for API documentation, you need to think about both business and technical personas, not just for consumption. So yes, a dev portal also need to have business content. Yes, it's very important. Without business content, people will not know what APIs they should use, or if they should use your API. Even if they're a customer, they might not be using your APIs. So that's really important. But it's not just in the consumption side, it's also in the authoring side. And what we see most of the time is that people either choose one. They'll choose the dev portal as a CMS approach, where they're mostly focusing on business personas, and then people need to go into the dev portal to author content in the system. Or they'll take the Docs as code approach, where they'll do their documentation creation in a code repository together with the code of the applications or the APIs, and then push the content live through a static site building process or something like that. Now, what we've done is we've combined both. We combine both. We have the CMS UI for business personas, so that they can create landing pages, this beautiful, well, it's not marketing, it's more explaining what this is about. Don't do hardcore marketing, don't. Developers hate it. And then we also have the DOCSIS code approach for Markdown files and the OpenAPI spec files that are being pushed through an automated process into the dev portal. The way we do it is we have the CMS as the single source where, the single publishing engine where all the content comes together. So we have the CMS content and the DOCSIS code content that is being pushed into the dev portal CMS, and then the dev portal CMS chooses what to show to whom, because we also often have role-based access control issues and things like that. And that allows you to use the CMS also to do content augmentation, which is a big problem in static site generation, because you have to do custom tooling for that kind of stuff. Anyway, the result is kind of like silos of content. For every API, you have some information, and that's like to some extent standardized. You'll have an OpenAPI spec file, you have a Markdown file, you have JSON file with metadata, Markdown for describing what the API is about, JSON file for metadata, so you can make it searchable and findable. And then you can do things like what DHL does with faceted search, is have an interface where all your APIs are listed, but you can like filter down. So you don't need to call your API __ capital A, small a, my name. And then on top of that, you can layer additional content to help people find the right piece of information. With landing pages or with tutorials and guides about individual building blocks that are covering a specific solution space for your dev portal, for your customers. And then TomTom, they won the the Dev Portal Awards were last week, so unfortunately you can't vote for it anymore. But TomTom won it last week. They won the first prize. And go and look their site. It's amazing. They've done a really, really good job. They've got lots of landing pages that are directing different personas to whatever they need to find. It's really well done. Yeah. So that was the easy problem. Because creating content, it's a problem of money and resources and of training and of getting people to see that's important to do content. And then if you spend enough energy on building content and on the technology to make it discoverable, that is to some extent solvable. Like if you spend enough energy, you can do that. The harder problem is the last one. There's more problems, but I focus on these two. Last week at API Docs, the conference we organized in Amsterdam, together with ABN AMRO, several people came to me from large enterprise and saying, okay, I get all this stuff. We need to do a lot of work, but we have got this problem. We're going to get money from management to build a dev portal, but then in 1 or 2 years from now, the business units need to start paying for it. And how do you do that? I was like, well, that's an interesting question. And I think the scary thing is, for me at least, because I'm fully in APIs. We focused our business on dev portals. That's the only thing we do today. We've been doing this now for 4 years. Before that, we were just a random whatever you want Drupal shop. And so what I'm afraid of, what I'm seeing is that people are not successful enough with APIs. So this is the scary part, right? Because we're here as an industry and we've got everything bet on this thing. And we need our customers to be really successful. And success does not mean, how do you become really successful? And yes, commercial success is great success. Like having an API product that's making money, that's awesome. And that's great. Your management is going to pay for you and you're good. But I think real success is something else. I think real success is not becoming, well, you can be successful with a product platform, don't get me wrong. But I think the real game, what everybody's playing for, is to become an affordance platform. And I'll explain you in a moment what that means, or what I think that means. I think you all agree on this. APIs are about digital transformation, right? It's about what we're trying to do is we're looking at the world and it's scary. Everything is changing. And competitors are popping up all over the place. They're disrupting all the businesses. It's just insane. This never was like this. It's something changed. And I think people think that, yeah, we need to become digital. But then you also see things like this. Forbes reported on what they called the Copernican revolution in management. And it's this idea that businesses are becoming more people-centric. Like their businesses are reorganizing around people rather than around procedures and processes and efficiency on processes. I think that these two things are the same thing. All right, this is my analysis of this. And I think what it's really about is about this. It's about the difference between complicated and complex systems. I know this is confusing. First time I saw it, it was like, that's the same thing, right? No. So complicated systems are things like watches or cars or most enterprise companies that are built for efficiency. They're built like massive machines where people are stuck into a very specific role, very well defined, so that they'll do exactly what is being told to them and be very efficient at doing what they're doing. Complex systems are systems with agents that have a lot of freedom, but that are showing emergent behavior. And they're not always super efficient, but they're really good at adaptation. And they can handle really weird stuff. Like if you have that flock of birds, a bird of prey shows up and magically they'll split apart and do all kinds of wonderful things. Ecosystems are like that. If you look at nature, it's all over the place. This is what nature does. And what I think happened is that with the rise of digital technology, the world has become so much more interconnected that the complexity of our world has gone up a lot, exponentially. When we used to be connected to just people around us, like 100 people, and then a couple of businesses. Like as a business, you had your local national markets. It was all quite safe. Now we're suddenly connected to everybody, or pretty much everybody we want to be connected to. I can message someone in China and get a reply tomorrow. A business can rise up in San Francisco and disrupt you here in Sweden, like in months. And so it's become so much faster and a lot more complex. And the landscape is constantly changing. So companies are kind of like large enterprises, are kind of like trees. They are adaptive as they grow, but then once they have grown fully, it's hard to change. And they're more stuck in their old ways and their structures. So I think what we need to do is to make our companies more like ant nests that are more adaptive. That can, like, you can take an ant nest as long as you have the queen and enough workers. You can drop them somewhere else. They'll build a new nest and be fine. A tree won't be fine. So I think what we need to try is to mimic this. What that practically means is that we need to move from integrated value flows, which are linear, to value networks that are much more adaptive. And we need to become from like this top-down, the top decides what needs to happen, and it takes years until we decide to do something. Like I've talked with companies where it took like a year and a half to get API management ordered. This is enterprise. I think we need to move towards organizations that are that have a much bigger surface for learning and that can adapt much quicker. So that instead of like an oil tanker, we become more like an ant nest or a beehive or an ant nest. But how do you do that? This is the question that I've been thinking about for a couple of years now, because we're trying to run a self-organizing team, and it's a hard question because like how do you scale and still remain flexible and adaptive? And I can't go too much in detail into it. I'm going to focus on some smaller aspects of it, but there's a whole science around this called complexity and systems thinking. There's a bunch of book recommendations at the end of my slides. I'll share my slides later so you can look it up and get some more inspiration. But I think the core thing is that we need to become complex adaptive systems. And we've always been that. Even large enterprises are to some extent complex adaptive systems. When we talk about culture, that's complex adaptive systems. The thing is that we've ossified our system so much, and we've created these structures that are so heavy that have taken away some of the adaptivity, because of which we are not as adaptive anymore as we could have been, or as ecosystems and just biological systems could be. Humans, by definition, are complex adaptive systems. We're always adapting, always changing, connecting with people. It's part of who we are. That's how we're built. This is, by the way, an example of like how ants find their way to food. So like when they go back to the nest, they put a pheromone trail down that tells the other ants like there's food in that direction. And the more ants that pass with food, the stronger these trails become. And that's how they keep on adapting and adjusting the foraging networks. And they don't need central control to do this. They can just follow the trails and build these trails as they go. Now, how do you get complexity? So this is kind of tricky, right? Because complexity sounds like a bad thing. Most of the time when we're talking about complexity, it sounds scary because it's unpredictable, you can't design it, you can't organize it, it just has to self-organize. But that's what we need. That's where we need to go. I was reading a course book on understanding complexity, and they talked about 4 variables that you can tune to get complex behavior. Interconnectedness, so like having a network, interdependence, making sure that the individual agents are interdependent to each other, diversity of agents, and adaptivity. Those are the 4 that you need. Now, crucial is that you can't be too little and you can't be too much. If you're too little, you're not complex. If it's too much, you're also not complex. It's very interesting. Now, my hypothesis is that API programs and developer portals as the communication tools for API programs can help with tuning complexity. It's still a hypothesis, but if you look at API programs, they're this central place where you can connect different parts of the business together to work together, to become more interdependent, to create new interconnections. Again, too much to explain in this talk, but there's a really interesting field called inner sourcing, which is about taking large enterprises and pretend that they're an open source community inside, and like getting interconnections going. Yeah. I think that through developers and through developer portals, and by tuning developer experience, we can tune some of these variables, at least some, maybe all. So, and then my hypothesis is that we can create complex adaptive systems or tune our organizations to be more complex adaptive. I'm going to try this hypothesis. We have currently 6 customers that we're talking with about internal developer portals. They're at least they're going to get a great developer portal, and maybe they're also going to get this. But this is a field that I'm researching, and I'll be reporting back next year with more information from what I've learned. How does this all connect to affordance platforms? More biology. Do you know mitochondria? Yeah, so they're the energy factories. They're hyper-constrained. They're like the worker bees of our cells. And because they're hyper-constrained and because they're able to deal with oxygen, they can create 16 times more energy than you can get from fermentation. And also because we have so much more mitochondria, like we have like hundreds of these in our cells, we can create so much more energy that we can afford having a lot more DNA than bacteria have, for example. Bacteria have to be very careful with their DNA because it costs a lot of energy to reproduce DNA. So they have a minimal set of DNA and they quickly lose stuff. We don't. We keep everything. We've got lots and lots of garbage around from all kinds of viral infections and whatever. We're storing it all, and we're kind of like DNA hamsters. So DNA are affordances. They are capabilities that allow us to do different things. And what we do as multicellular organisms is we build platforms. Like in our intestines, we have these villi, and they basically create this giant surface for bacteria to live on. Yeah. And I think that's what affordance platforms do, is that they have these affordances internally that they use internally, like Amazon and Google, and they expose them externally to create marketplaces. So I think that is the end game. Now, I'm going to stop here. There's more. Talk to me later. I've got some ideas about how you pay for this and all of that. And I'll be presenting more about this. If you want this as a keynote, I would love to keynote about it and get some more time. Yeah, I'll end here. Thank you.